let's talk about the poems a little bit. One thing that I've noticed is whenever I read Sestinas, even among some of the better published poets, they tend to range from mediocre to pretty bad. You wrote a double Sestina called the Twin Towers Canyon. So why do you think that so many Sestinas just fail so miserably whenever they are written, even by otherwise good poets? And what makes Twin Towers Canyon different?
Well, it's canon, not canyon. Canon, as in the song like row 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 the boat. The problem with Sestinas is the problem with a lot of tight forms. Villanelles also have a lot of problems. Not quite as much as Sestina, since a villanelle is only about half the length. The problem comes in not only with the rhyme scheme of a sestina, but the repetition of the end words of each line. It's hard to pick because you go through. I think it's 36 plus 3, so it's like 39 lines. So that's six. It's seven times the same 6 words have to be reused, and to reuse them in ways that are slightly different. Use it as a noun. Use it as a pronoun, as a verb, an adverb, a modifier, or something. To find ways to use that is difficult. Also because those same words are reused, it tends to shrink the universe of what you can write about. So you have to find something, a topic, a theme that lends itself naturally to such a constriction, and that's very difficult. A lot of times sestinas are love poems because you can say love over and over again. You can say beauty over and over again. You can say uh, heart or over and over again, but it's difficult. Like I said, villanelles also have that problem, not to the degree. The thing with the Twin Towers canon is, uh, and this was written a couple of years before 9/11, but because you have two, it lends itself to a natural doubling, and so the two cannons are also set off by that about 3 lines, so that you have, if you had two people reading them, you'd have that row 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 your boat kind of effect, and one of the towers was slightly taller than the other as well, so there's that visual element. But you know, because I'm taking something that's totally outside of what most sestinas are written about, which are usually written in the first person, usually written about emotions, it lends itself more, if you're talking about the structure or the height, or looking at an inanimate object with some emotion, it lends itself more uh, to repetition, just because the words that you're using and the theme that you're talking about is more naturally alien to the form. Yet because we're talking about the Twin Towers, it lends itself to repetition because each of the towers were basically almost identical. So in that way, it does it. When I've done star sonnets too, uh, you have to find my best star sonnet, the Siamese Reflection, about the first known, or the first famous conjoined twins who became known as the Siamese twins, Chang and Eng. That's a perfect topic for having a double star sonnet that's linked by just one stanza is the perfect way to physically represent conjoined twins. So when you're doing strict forms like that, it pays to have form follow function in that sense. If I was just writing about eating a peanut butter sandwich, it probably wouldn't be as effective to write a canon about that, much less a star sonnet of some type. So you have to when you're doing a formal poetry, you are naturally constricting yourself. Even sonnets or even a haiku, 575 syllables, you're restricting yourself. So you have to find moments, let's say in a haiku, that can fit into that nugget. You just can't jam anything into it because it's likely not going to work. This is one of the advantages of free verse, is that you are free to do things that may otherwise uh, 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 could be constricted if you tried to put it in formal verse. The benefits of doing something formally, though, is if you're good enough and skilled enough, you can take those constrictions and flip them and make them into a positive, like I said, because if you take something alien, uh, a good example of doing that just outside of form is when you invert a cliche. If I write, and I think I've mentioned this to you before, if you write, oh, use a cliche like broken heart. Well, if you're writing a love poem, you know, it's next to impossible to redeem that. But if the broken heart has to do with, say, one of Custer's men at the Battle of Little Bighorn getting killed by an arrow from one of the Indians, well, literally his heart is going to be sundered in twain, and so it has a resonance that putting just the emotional cliche isn't going to have. So these are the ways that you can re-say things. I was explaining, there was a guy at work, a younger fellow who I've been working with the last couple of Fridays, and he's one of these people who has sort of these vague artistic leanings, but he's not really a writer himself, and he was telling me he was going through a phase, and I was explaining some of this to him, and I brought up on the computer when we had a downtime. I brought up a sonnet of mine called "Midnight at a White Castle" in Bloomington, Minnesota, and I explained to him how it's about basically a poor girl who's hungry looking into a white castle in Minnesota at the people eating their fast food. And it references the famous painting by Edward Hopper, Nighthawks. It uses just by using that word. So it references that famous painting, but it's also about classism, that this poor child is outside the window looking in. But even though it's never stated, it's likely, because it's called a White Castle, and there's the girl who's outside the privilege, and she's looking through glass, and I call it a boundary that never was. It's likely that the child outside, the young girl, is non-white, possibly, most likely black, since this is America, and we're talking about a white person, black, white, but definitely probably non-white. But it's never specifically stated. And I was explaining to this fellow how, it's one of the best poems you're ever going to read about American racism or American classism if you don't get the racial aspect. But I never mentioned black, Negro. I don't mention white, Caucasian. Uh, it deals with it by putting it in a really unique metaphor that's going to have far more power than if I just say lynching is wrong, racism is wrong, don't use the N word. You can't hit people and preach to them. You have to use technique, and you have to sometimes be subtle. And that's a thing too. A lot of these forms like villanelles and sestinas lack subtlety just in their formal construction. So it's hard to sort of find a workaround that, and writers who are young and inexperienced and just not that good just can't do it. And I think I only wrote, other than the Twin Towers canon, 2 or 3 sestinas, because like I said, it's one of those things you have to find the actual topic that'll work for it. The double star sonnet that I did about the Siamese twins, again, was the perfect form. But if I tried to write a double star sonnet about, Abraham Lincoln's assassination, it probably wouldn't work as well, unless I had something that naturally lent itself to that kind of physical layout. So that's basically why Sestinas don't work and why the Twin Towers canon does.